You're listening to the Okanagan Reader, where we present readings of short stories and other works that have been released under a Creative Commons license by their creators. In keeping with the license, these recordings are released under a matching license. You are free to listen to and share these readings as set out in their version of the Creative Commons license. Today's reading is Water Off a Black Dog's Back, Part 2, a short story in the collection Stranger Things Happen by Kelly Link. Back to the question, please. Which do you choose, water or love? What happens if I choose wrong? You'll find out, won't you? Which would you choose? That's my question, Carol. You already asked yours. You still haven't answered me either. All right, let me think for a bit. Rachel had straight reddish-brown hair that fell precisely to her shoulders and then stopped. Her eyes were fox-colored, and she had more small, even teeth than seemed absolutely necessary to Carol. She smiled at him, and when she bent over the tackle-box full of noses, Carol could see the two wings of her shoulder blades beneath the thin cotton T-shirt, her vertebrae outlined like a knobby strand of coral. As they went in to dinner, she whispered in his ear, "My mother has a wooden leg." She led him into the kitchen to meet her mother. The air in the kitchen was hot and moist, and little beads of sweat stood out on Mrs. Rook's face. Rachel's mother resembled Rachel in the way that Mr. Rook's wooden nose resembled a real nose, as if someone had hacked Mrs. Rook out of wood or granite. She had large hands with long, yellowed fingernails, and all over her black dress were short black dog hairs. "So you're a librarian," she said to Carol. "Part-time," Carol said. "Yes, ma'am." "What do you do the rest of the time?" she said. "I take classes." Mrs. Rook stared at him without blinking. "Are your parents still alive?" "My mother is," Carol said. "She lives in Florida. She plays bridge." Rachel grabbed Carol's arm. "Come on," she said. "The food's getting cold." She pulled him into a dining room with dark wood paneling and a long table set for 4 people. The long black hem of Mrs. Rook's dress hissed along the floor as she pulled her chair into the table. Carol sat down next to her. Was it the right or the left? He tucked his feet under his chair. Both women were silent, and Carol was silent between them. Mr. Rook talked instead, filling in the awkward, empty pause so that Carol was glad that it was his nose and not his tongue that the Beiderbecke boy had bitten off. How had she lost her leg? Mrs. Rook watched Carol with a cold and methodical eye as he ate, and he held Rachel's hand under the table for comfort. He was convinced that her mother knew this and disapproved. He ate his pork and peas, balancing the peas on the blade of his knife. He hated peas. In between mouthfuls, he gulped down the pink wine in his glass. It was sweet and strong and tasted of burnt sugar. "Is this apple wine?" he asked. "It's delicious." "It's strawberry wine," Mr. Rook said, pleased. "We have more. We make up a batch every year. I can't taste it myself, but it's strong stuff." Rachel filled Carol's empty glass and watched him drain it instantly. "If you've finished, why don't you let my mother take you to meet the dogs? You look like you could use some fresh air. I'll stay here and help Daddy do the dishes." "Go on," she said. "Go." Mrs. Rook pushed her chair back from the table, pushed herself out of the chair. "Well, come on," she said. "I don't bite." Outside, the moths beat at his face, and he reeled beside Rachel's mother on the moony white gravel. light as a thread spun out on its spool. She walked quickly, leaning forward a little as her right foot came down, dragging the left foot through the small stones. "What kind of dogs are they?" he said. "Black ones," she said. "What are their names?" "Flower and Acorn," she said, and flung open the barn door. Two Labradors, slippery as a black trout in the moonlight, surged up at Carol. They thrust their velvet muzzles at him, uttering angry staccato coughs, their rough breath steaming at his face. They were the size of small ponies, and their paws left muddy prints on his shirt. Carol pushed them back down, and they snapped at his hands. "Heel," Mrs. Rook said, and instantly the two dogs went to her, arranging themselves on either side like bookends. Against the folds of her skirt they were nearly invisible, only their saucer-like eyes flashing wickedly at Carol. "Flower's pregnant," Mrs. Rook said. "We've tried to breed them before, but it never took. Go for a run, girl. Go with her, Acorn." The dogs loped off, moonlight spilling off their coats like water. Carol watched them run. The stale air of the barn washed over him, and under the bell of Mrs. Rook's skirt he pictured the dark wood of her left leg, the white flesh of the right leg like a pair of mismatched dice. Mrs. Rook drew in her breath and said, "I don't mind you sleeping with my daughter, but you had better not get her pregnant." Carol said, "No, ma'am." "If you give her a bastard, I'll set the dogs on you," she said, and went back towards the house. Carol scrambled after her. On Friday, Carol was shelving new books on the third floor. He stood, both arms lifted up to steady a wavering row of psychology periodicals. Someone paused in the narrow row directly behind him, and a small, cold hand insinuated itself into his trousers, slipping under the waistband of his underwear. "Rachel," he said, and the hand squeezed slowly. He jumped, and the row of books toppled off their shelf like dominoes. He bent to pick them up, not looking at her. "I forgive you," he said. "That's nice," she said. "For what?" "For not telling me about your father's—" He hesitated, looking for the word. "Wound." "I thought you handled that very well," she said, "and I did tell you about my mother's leg." "I wasn't sure whether or not to believe you. How did she lose it?" "She swims down in the pond. She was walking back up to the house. She was barefoot. She sliced her foot open on something. By the time she went to see a doctor, she had septicemia, and her leg had to be amputated just below the knee. Daddy made her a replacement out of walnut. He said the prosthesis that the hospital wanted to give her looked nothing like the leg she'd lost. It has a name carved on it. She used to tell me that a ghost lived inside it and helped her walk. I was 4 years old." She didn't look at him as she spoke, flicking the dust off the spine of a tented book with her long fingers. "What was its name?" Carol asked. "Ellen," Rachel said. 2 days after they had first met, Carol was in the basement stacks. It was dark in the aisles, the tall shelves curving towards each other. The lights were controlled by timers, and went off and on untouched by human hand. There was the ominous sound of ticking as the timers clicked off row by row. Puddles of dirty yellow light wavered under his feet, the floor as slick as water. There was one other student on this floor, a boy who trod at Carol's heels, breathing heavily. Rachel was in a back corner, partly hidden by a shelving cart. God damn it to hell," she was saying as she flung a book down. Stupid book! Stupid, useless, stupid, know-nothing books! She kicked at the book several times more and stomped on it for good measure. Then she looked up and saw Carol and the boy behind him. "Oh," she said, "you again." Carol turned and glared at the boy. "What's the matter?" he said. "Haven't you ever seen a librarian at work?" The boy fled. "What's the matter?" Carol said again. "Nothing," Rachel said. "I'm just tired of reading stupid books about books about books. It's 10 times worse than my mother ever said." She looked at him, weighing him up. She said, "Have you ever made love in a library?" Carol said, "No." Rachel stripped off her woolly sweater, her blue undershirt. Underneath, her bare flesh burned. The lights clicked off 2 rows down, then the row beside Carol, and he moved forward to find Rachel before she vanished. Her body was hot and dry, like a newly extinguished bulb. Rachel seemed to enjoy making love in the library. The library officially closed at midnight, and on Tuesdays and Thursdays, when he was the last of the staff to leave, Carol left the east entrance unlocked for Rachel while he made up a pallet of jackets and sweaters from the lost and found. The first night, he had arranged a makeshift bed in the aisle between PR878W6B37 relative creatures and PR878W6B35 corrupt relations. In the summer, the stacks had been much cooler than his unair-conditioned room. He had hoped to woo her into his bed by the time the weather turned, but it was October already. Rachel pulled PR878W6A9 out to use as a pillow. "I thought you didn't like books," he said, trying to make a joke. "My mother doesn't like books," she said, "or libraries, which is a good thing. You don't ever have to worry about her looking for me here." When they made love, Rachel kept her eyes closed. Carol watched her face, her body rocking beneath him like water. He closed his eyes, opening them quickly again, hoping to catch her looking back at him. Did he please her? He pleased himself, and her breath quickened upon his neck. Her hands smoothed his body, moving restlessly back and forth until he gathered them to himself, biting at her knuckles. Later, he lay prone as she moved over him, her knees clasping his waist, her narrow feet cupped under the stirrups of his knees. They lay hinged together, and Carol squinted his eyes shut to make the exit sign fuzzy in the darkness. He imagined that they had just made love in a forest, and the red glow was a campfire. He imagined that they were not on the 3rd floor of a library, but on the shore of a deep black lake in the middle of a stand of tall trees. "When you were a teenager," Rachel said, "what was the worst thing you ever did?" Carol thought for a moment. "When I was a teenager," he said, "I used to go into my room every day after school and masturbate. And my dog Sonny used to stand outside the door and whine. I'd come in a handful of Kleenex, and afterward I never knew what to do with them. If I threw them in the wastebasket, my mother might notice them piling up. If I dropped them under the bed, then Sonny would sneak in later and eat them. It was a revolting dilemma, and every day I swore I wouldn't ever do it again." "That's disgusting, Carol." Carol was constantly amazed at the things he told Rachel, as if love was some sort of hook she used to drag secrets out of him, things that he had forgotten until she asked for them. "Your turn," he said. Rachel curled herself against him. "Well, when I was little and I did something bad, my mother used to take off her wooden leg and spank me with it. When I got older and started being asked out on dates, she would forbid me. She actually said, "I forbid you to go," just like a Victorian novel. I would wait until she took her bath after dinner, and steal her leg and hide it. And I would stay out as late as I wanted. When I got home, she was always sitting at the kitchen table, with the leg strapped back on. She always found it before I got home, but I always stayed away as long as I could. I never came home before I had to. When I was little, I hated her leg. It was like her other child, the obedient daughter. I was the one she had to spank. I thought the leg told her when I was bad, and I could feel it gloating whenever she punished me. I hid it from her in closets or in the belly of the grandfather clock. Once I buried it out in the strawberry field, because I knew it hated the dark. It was scared of the dark, like me. Carol eased away from her, rolling over on his stomach. The whole time she had been talking, her voice had been calm, her breath tickling his throat. Telling her about Sonny, the semen-eating dog, he had sprouted a cheerful little erection. Listening to her, it had melted away, and his balls had crept up his goose-pimpled thighs. Somewhere a timer clicked, and a light turned off. "Let's make love again," she said, and seized him in her hand. He nearly screamed.